Good afternoon and welcome everybody to our second concurrent panel. I'm Dr. Jake Leach from the Palm Beach County Office of Resilience. We've got a great panel discussion lined up for you this afternoon. Before we get started, we'll be seeing another short video to spotlight climate resiliency in Palm Beach County. This time we'll be hearing from Vice Mayor Greg Weiss. Let's take a look.
It's impacting us in a number of ways. District 2 does border along the Lake Worth Lagoon, and so we're seeing impacts from sunny day flooding. And so as you know, we see an increase in water levels in the lagoon. Our stormwater system's not able to keep up with that. Additionally, if you look a little to the west, we have some low-lying areas within the district as well that get flooded and see a significant impact due to that flooding. And so we're going to need to make some changes both to the levels that we're building at, but as also as how we're going to move that stormwater away from our roads and homes and properties in the district. Some of the most difficult challenges that we have right now, number one is education, helping people understand the impacts, how quickly they're happening, how much we're going to have to adjust to them and make changes, and the costs involved. So these are long-term impacts that they're not going away, and we're going to continue to need to invest our resources, but we're going to need to partner with the state and federal government because this is beyond what a local government alone can manage. My message to them is to continue to push on the levers of political power, if you will, of the importance of addressing this. We see the impacts every day, and yet we continue to make some of the same mistakes that we've made in the past. So addressing the low-hanging fruit, if you will, early on, and as things become more challenging, we'll be prepared to be able to take on those bigger tasks. But I'm delighted to have so many young people involved because this is the existential threat to all of us going forward. I mean, we go from the beaches all the way to the Everglades, from the farmlands to the urban areas. There is something here for everybody, whether you're a water person, an equestrian. There's just a lot of things to do and see, but so much of it is based on the natural environment that we are so blessed to have here in Palm Beach County.
All right, thank you, Vice Mayor Weiss. Mentioning that stormwater issue is a perfect pivot to our next panel, which is Building Better, Embedding Resilience in Capital Infrastructure. In this session, we'll be hearing about the intersection between infrastructure and climate, the vulnerability of our infrastructure to the consequences of climate change, and the climate solutions we can build into our infrastructure. Our moderator for this panel is Mr. Peter Moore, President and CEO of Chen Moore & Associates, a multidisciplinary engineering and design firm headquartered in Fort Lauderdale, but with offices throughout the state. Mr. Moore is a licensed professional engineer, holds a master's degree in engineering from the University of Florida. And to hear more about him and all of our panelists, please see the bios for them underneath this video at the bottom of this page. Please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A, and hopefully we'll get to some of those at the end of the session. And with that, Mr. Moore, it's over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Leach. I very much appreciate this opportunity. Following decades of underinvestment, nationwide, there's an increasing recognition of the deep need to upgrade our infrastructure, as evidenced by the recent passage of the National Infrastructure Act. Ranging from transit to wastewater, energy to stormwater, service disruptions, economic losses, and environmental consequences of poorly functioning systems have revealed system inadequacies and the gap in funds needed to properly invest in these systems. Climate change impacts have added to this exposure as extreme rainfall, temperatures, storm surge, wildfires, and other events create conditions exceeding our design standards. Panelists in this session will discuss challenges and opportunities for community resilience via infrastructure improvement with consideration of materials and technology, equity, and finance. From local to national scales, participants will share insights and experience along with recommendations for positive transformation and change. Please let me introduce the panel. Jerry Buckwalter is the Chief Innovation Officer responsible for helping to shape the strategic direction and long-term value of the society. He's a long-term member of the American Society of Civil Engineers Industry Leaders Coalition, along with his service in the National Infrastructure Academy Council, reporting to Presidents Bush and Obama, which led to the study to define critical infrastructure resilience. He currently leads the ASCE Future World Vision Project that examines infrastructure 50 years into the future. Welcome, Jerry. Christina Swallow, Director of Nevada Department of Transportation, an engineer with more than 25 years of experience and a diverse background that includes transportation, land use, public policy, and community advocacy. A particular note is Ms. Swallow's service as the American Society of Civil Engineers 2018 President and leadership in developing the ASCE's 2021 report card for America's infrastructure. Welcome, Director Swallow. Mario Loaiza is a client account manager with Jacobs in Southeast Florida, having 24 years of Florida-specific experience in both the public and private sectors. As a former utility director in both Palm Beach and Martin counties, and having served in various boards and committees, Mario understands the responsibility we all share in today's challenges while incorporating the impacts of climate change into the built environment. Mario specializes in water and wastewater utility program management, design, and operations. Welcome, Mario. Elizabeth Perez is the president and founder of Collective Water Resources. Liz has years of experience with a focus on stormwater, climate change, and watershed approaches. Liz is passionate about meaningful engagement on issues of climate and the environment and believes good data and even better engineers are the key to that future. Welcome, Liz. We have a fantastic panel here today, and so I'm going to jump right into it, beginning with Mr. Buckwalter. Jerry, perhaps you can begin by sharing your role and charge as the Chief Innovation Officer with ASCE and how that relates to the Future World Vision Project. How have these and other roles influenced your views on infrastructure resilience, and how should we be preparing as a nation?
Thank you, Peter. A great deal of my role is to do the non-traditional part of civil engineering. It's to help us be more forward-leaning, and by that I mean really long-term, which we say, but we rarely do, and to be more creative and innovative in what we're going to have to do. So the lessons that I've learned are, just to use an example, there's engineers in the world who build cell phones. We don't do that. They're designed for the batteries to wear out in 2 years and for them to be overloaded, and you go buy your next one. The infrastructure that we design and build and maintain is designed to last for 5, 10, 20, 50, 100 years. We say that, but we rarely look out far enough to say, so what does that look like in 100 years? So my role is to help take some small percentage of engineering time to look out that far, look at the outcomes that we want, and that will help advise us on what we need to design and build. I'll give you one quick example from history. In the first decade of the 20th century, there was a convening of engineers all over the world, from all over the world in London, to look at what was the cities of the world's most pressing problem. It was manure in the streets. There were projections made of how deep that was going to get with all the horses and carriages and the pedestrians that were trying to walk through it. Now, we look back now and we say, not only was that wrong, it was ridiculous, because they couldn't imagine the internal combustion engine and the implication on the urban environment and what the infrastructure would need to be. I wonder 100 years from now, What are we going to say when we look back at today and say, what in the world were we thinking? What is the condition of the built environment that we expect is perfectly plausible in 50 or 100 years? And that should help inform our activities more than we let it do currently today. So that's my job, is to be someone who provokes everyone, hopefully in a good way, to think about those things.
Okay, panelists, any other thoughts? Okay, hearing none. Director Swallow, as chair of the America's Committee on, as chair of Committee on America's Infrastructure, you led a diverse team to produce the ASCE report card on America's infrastructure. What can you tell us about the most recent report card for the nation and for Florida? What should we take away from the report findings? And just as importantly, what are the economics of the accompanying failure to act report?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. This is the America's Infrastructure Report Card. Is something we do every 4 years, and it's really become something that our elected leaders look to as a reference and as a resource when we're trying to talk about how infrastructure impacts our communities. And so the good news is the most recent national report card saw the cumulative GPA go up slightly from a D+ to a C-. It's the first time that grade has not been in the Ds. Unfortunately, while that is encouraging, 11 of the categories are still in the D range. What we did see, though, was the categories that did go up, they benefited from improved asset management practices, increased investments at all levels of government, and in particular, modest increase of federal investment in inland waterways, ports, and drinking water contributed to improved grades in those categories. So what we're seeing is, we've been ringing this alarm bell for quite some time, but what we are seeing, proof is in the pudding, investment works. And I think that helped get us to the point where we are with the IIJA. But before I get to that, I did want to talk a little bit about Florida's report card. Even though I'm not in Florida, I am a little bit aware of the report card, and it included even better news. The state's infrastructure earned a cumulative grade of a C. So grades across 14 categories in Florida ranged from a B+ for solid waste to a D- for dams. And in general, the state's transportation networks, roads, bridges, ports, and aviation are in good condition and accommodating the ever increasing population of Florida. It is of note that the state is very careful to be, and maybe not on the bleeding edge, but the leading edge, incorporating the latest technologies to really leverage the funding that is available. And of course, I'm not telling anybody anything you don't already know. Severe storms and the increasing rate of those storms is impacting all of the state's infrastructure networks. And so resilience concerns are of course on top of mind to everyone. So let me get back to the IIJA. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was signed into law on November 15th. And that is, I think, probably in the infrastructure space, the news of the year. It is a $1.2 trillion investment in our core infrastructure. It includes bridges and roads, waterway networks, drinking water pipes, and a lot more. It invests over $50 billion in resilient infrastructure. And that's important because we've really been focusing on making sure that we are thinking about the resiliency of the infrastructure. It costs a lot more to build it back than it does to build it resiliently in the first place. And I am sure that Florida will be able to benefit from some of the funding for pre-mitigation and post-disaster projects. It is important to understand, though, that the IIJA funding, while it will be helpful, it does not solve all of our problems. ASCE estimates that there's a $2.6 trillion investment gap over the next 10 years. And IIJA provides roughly $480 billion above baseline funding. So about 20% of that gap, but it's only over 5 years. So if we continue funding at that level, we'll get to about 40% of the gap in a 10-year period. So there are still significant contributions that will be needed from state and local partners over the next 5 years and moving forward beyond that. And in case anyone's wondering, what does that really mean when we talk about that funding gap? Well, ASCE does an economic study every 4 years in alignment with the report card. That failure to act study finds that over the next 20 years, the average American household will spend roughly $3,300 a year due to infrastructure deficiencies. That's lost disposable income that they can't spend on other things. And it comes from the disruptions in inadequate infrastructure, like sitting in traffic, hitting a pothole, having to replace your tire, power outages. Those are increasingly severe and increasingly frequent. And water main breaks. So it's important, and we're very excited that the federal government decided to invest at this higher level in our infrastructure, because it hits American pocketbooks every single day.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Director. Are there any other comments from the panelists on this?
Peter, I might, and not to make this an American Society of Civil Engineering sales pitch, but Christina and I have worked on, and you have as well, some of these tandem things where the report card, the failure to act, is the clarion call to the current situation and the near-term situation, and the Future World Vision Project helps us have a clarion call to the long term. I think the two go hand in hand and are part of that bimodal way engineers have to learn to think.
Thank you, Jerry. I absolutely agree. One of the interesting things, actually, the lowest grade that was given in the Florida report card for dams is just because there's actually just a lack of information relating to them, and really just trying to get some clarity of information is one of the most difficult things that we have, because that's what's even scarier, is that we just don't know what we don't know. All right, anything else from the panelists? Okay, Mario, pull you up next. Considering impacts of climate change and sea level rise in particular, much of the regional focus to date has been on flood risk. As you know, resiliency in water management and systems is multidimensional. What we are overlooking as it pertains to additional exposures is what steps should local governments and utilities be taking to be more holistic in their resilience efforts?
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate that. I'll answer that. Before I get to that, I do, the irony is not lost on me that the report card grade point average for America from ASE is similar to your and my grade point average in college in our bachelor's degree. So I
was going to make that
that
remark, my friend, but
C's get degrees. So appreciate that. We need to do better. But in all seriousness, our exposures are everywhere. I mean, having managed water and wastewater utilities, for me, the focus is certainly on infrastructure. Our water supply, being open, and if you have shallow wells or influenced by, obviously flooding and what have you, our wastewater collection systems and on the treatment side, there's obviously challenges, including cross-contamination and overflows from storm events, named storms or just heavy storm events. And likewise, even in heavy dry conditions, extreme heat, you've got a problem with water supply, and you have drought restrictions and what have you. So you have both, swinging ends of the spectrum that are both, challenging, that we are exposed. So, we have to, we have loss of power, obviously, during a hurricane here in Florida. We have to deal with that, the inability to pump and treat water. But ultimately, the surcharges in the wastewater plants during events is really tough, because then you get the overflows. And not unlike Jerry's example about manure in the streets, if you have overflows, you basically have manure in the streets again, even in 2021. I mean, it's the same problem. So maybe they were right. So, but some of those solutions that we have to kind of lean towards and talk about, and look at a forward-thinking mindset as it pertains to climate change, and how we have to, what we can do to sort of short-term and the near-term and then long-term. Some things we can do now is, like, people have talked obviously about septic to sewer conversion projects, especially in lower elevation with surface impacts to surface waters with nitrogen and phosphorus. We have to eliminate those septic type receiving facilities. Just frankly, just don't work. They don't work anymore when you're at the coast and the water levels are what they are. They don't work. Water tightening, right? So we have sewer collection systems. They need to be oftentimes, I&I or infiltration inflow is a problem that happens all year round, especially with a high water table. So that's something that, you can use smoke tests, and you can do things to help repair those and replace them. But also the materials that you use and construction methods also can help, alleviate some of those problems. But, and beyond that, when you go to plan for new infrastructure, you want to check your finished floor elevations, the bottom elevation of your electric panels and what have you. You want them to be above those thresholds, and to make sure that you plan for those elevations that will be coming, and hopefully the tide water conditions.
Excellent. Thank you, Mario. Any other comments from the panel on that? All right. last but certainly not least, Elizabeth. You and I went to college at the same time, only because they allowed teenagers in the University of Florida then. You and I have worked closely with local governments in addressing climate vulnerabilities and developing adaptation plans. You are quite familiar with the historic conflict between meeting flood protection needs, sea level rise, and water quality goals. Do you think this is a growing tension or a growing opportunity? How far do you think green infrastructure can take us in terms of mitigating for the growing rise of flood risk?
Thank you for the question, Peter, and thanks to the Compact for having me here today. So being an optimist, I have to say, I really hope there's not a tension. I think that tension might come from the fact that some of us thought that the issue of water quality and flood protection could be the result of the same menu, that we could just order the same menu item and both items would be taken care of, both issues would be taken care of. And that's just simply not true. I don't think it was ever intended that, for example, low impact development or green infrastructure for stormwater was going to be, nor has it ever been, a really strong aspect of flood protection. However, the two do go hand in hand and should go hand in hand as we move forward. We've talked a lot today about Palm Beach County and the Lake Worth Lagoon and the quality of life that we enjoy here in South Florida. So without protecting water quality, all of this flood protection is for naught. So we have absolutely got to get the water quality and ecology right so that we can continue on. So we do need things from the engineering profession, like the time and resources and the data. Peter mentioned data as well, to do things like continuous simulation to engineer these low impact design systems. And we're also sitting in a session right now that's called Building Better. But as engineers and all of us that work on infrastructure, we've also got to have the ability to adapt our projects over time. A lot of us engineers, we like to think, I'm putting this in the ground, it's going to last 50 years as is, 100 years as is. But we've got to build our projects to be more adaptable. And then we've got to look at how those will be operated and maintained as well. So to make that 100 years, we've really got to start thinking about the entire life cycle of the project, not to mention that our engineering cookbooks, you know, a lot of us, Peter mentioned that we went to school at the same time. You know, we were given textbooks at the time and we were told this is how it's done. And I think I'm talking to a lot of the younger people on today, but it's so true that the engineering profession right now, one of the most important things we can do is come together and work on adapting these textbooks, right? Textbooks aren't even the paper textbooks that we used back in the day anymore. So we've got to come together and rewrite these textbooks and create these living ways of updating our ways of designing, adapting, operating, and maintaining these projects. That's really the only way we're going to get there.
Thank you, Liz. Any other follow-up from the panelists?
No, I will say that, you know, she's correct though. These younger engineers, certainly at Jacobs, they look at me like a dinosaur when they look at my bookshelf, and they have a civil engineering reference manual with all my tabs in it and everything else. You know, my HP calculator that does reverse polar notation. They're like, what are you doing? You know, these younger generation, it's all digital. It's all, you know, it's malleable, and rightly so. It should change. It shouldn't be stagnant. But,
you know, one of the things that hasn't changed is that the education, that the information in the education really hasn't changed. And I think that's one of Liz's points, right? We've got to evolve in how we use that underlying science, those underlying formulas. Like, how do we use them to make sure that we're using them in a way that meets the needs of tomorrow? And that is one of the things that I think really hasn't changed. The delivery of the education may have changed, but the application of it, I think we have a lot of room to move in that space.
Excellent. And I don't know about you guys, but I had to sell back my textbooks at the end of the year in order to afford beer money for the next semester. So I apologize to all those that don't have a shelf like you, Mario. All right, moving on to the next question. I'm sorry, Jerry, beyond risk reduction, How can resiliency planning and investment advance the competitive economic position of a region? What might this look like? And how do local governments plan effectively while leaving room in the way of options to accommodate the unknown?
Okay. I'll give you two thoughts on that one. And one, I'm just going to use an example. So I'm going to go back to my previous life when I was part of the classic corporate C-suite teams of several of the Fortune 100 companies, mostly engineering or technology-based companies. So as part of that role, I was one of a small group of people that would decide where we might put our offices, our manufacturing plants, our processing operations, our IT operations. And I think, so I'm just giving you a snapshot from a private enterprise perspective, but I think that's a good corollary for this whole economic question. I think people would be surprised. There's at the top three factors that caused us to decide where we would put operations. There's lots of components, but the top three were: one, access to the right talent and skill set. Two was the corporate tax rate. No surprise there. But three, surprisingly, was the quality and planned resilience of the infrastructure writ large. We actually took, I worked for the classic military national defense company, several of them. We would actually take high quality, high paying jobs and move them offshore, not because of the classic, the stereotype, oh, this job went to India or someplace else for low wages. No, we were offshoring high paid jobs because the commute times was no longer a high enough quality of life for highly paid engineers that we were hiring, along with talent and skill set and corporate tax rate. People would be shocked at how important that has become to companies deciding where they're going to operate. We have a role to play here in making sure that is attractive. And I firmly believe, from my experience in those decisions for 20, 30 years, that plays a more important role than people realize. Now, my second point is economic development, which is hugely composed of high quality jobs for people and activities. Also, the companies that do that look really far out. They don't place a manufacturing plant or an IT operation somewhere because they expect it to be there for 5 years. They want it to be there for 50 years. And they want people to put down roots and grow families and be locked to that region. And so those are very careful decisions made with a very long-term perspective on the quality of the infrastructure and the perception of its resilience. So those in coastal regions, as you've been discussing, I guarantee you the top 100 companies of the world evaluate every coastal region's resiliency plans for sea level rise before they make those decisions, and whether they believe it's for real or not. So that's kind of my take from my previous life on a component that goes into this economic equation.
And if I could, Jerry, one of the questions that's come from the floor relates to what is your perspective on the barriers to securing the needed capital in order to build an uncertain, in order to build capital in order to deal with this in an uncertain environment? What are the barriers and solutions to? What are some of those great things that either private or public entities have done in the past, or what should we be looking for?
Okay, I'm going to give you I'm going to put a full disclaimer on my answer. Personal opinion only, based upon working with some infrastructure finance people for a long time. We have some inherent barriers in the US in the way we contract and acquire built environment and the way we fund it that inherently creates headwinds and barriers to being resilient. I'll give you a couple examples. We use bond issues a lot in this country. Those bond issues rarely, almost never, allow you to raise the money for the life cycle operation maintenance of that. It's not allowed by law. You've built in a barrier to long-term resilience in your funding plan when you do that. I'm not saying bond issues are bad. I'm just saying we need to be aware we are designing in sometimes the easiest path to get it funded, but creating barriers to long-term life cycle thinking and a way that makes it economically viable. So that funding path is a big one in the challenges. I will tell you this, I've worked with several people who have made massive infrastructure investments using sovereign wealth funds out of the Middle East and out of Europe, and almost zero of their money comes to the US because they can't get the risk down because of the life cycle issues that they want addressed when they put private money. Now, no one's saying we should only use private money. There's some mix of public and private money that we ought to do. And
Peter, I had a couple other thoughts on that resiliency planning, but also on that follow-up question that you just asked. I know that we're all operating in a resource constrained environment. And while the data is out there and those that are in this space fully are aware that it costs a lot more. And when I say a lot more, the data shows it costs at least 6 times more to replace it than it would have been to invest and build it properly in the first place. So the data is there. It's a lot more expensive to replace it. The challenge is we're so resource constrained that when you're saying, I need to do this, that, and this other thing, it's hard sometimes for when you're planning to say, well, we're only going to do this one thing, or maybe we're only going to do 2 of those 4 because we're going to invest a lot more in those to save for, I'm going to call it an uncertain future. And we know it's true. We know it's happening, it's coming, but I think there's a little bit of a gamble. Is it going to happen to this piece of infrastructure? So I think like there's a lot of challenges in terms of public perception on the investment, and we're resource constrained. We need to do all of the things. And in order to do 1 or 2 of them really well, it might take away from. So I think there's some challenges there for sure. And it's hard to say, well, you know what, if we got to replace it, it's going to cost 6 times as much. We don't think like that. We don't think about tomorrow, I think is one of the challenges. But one of the core pieces of your question was talking about how do local agencies, how should state and local agencies, how should they think about this? And one of the things that we've seen here in Nevada is we're really looking at breaking down those silos and having very cross-purpose programs, contracts, agreements. So we're working across all of the state agencies, but also with the local partners, with the tribal agencies, to make sure we all understand who has what resources. Because we don't all need to have all of the resources. There should be some redundancy, but we also need to know where to turn if you need something. And I can think about a couple events last year during the riots. They turned to our program at NDOT. Can we help with closures? Right? It was a local agency, but they needed some help with manning some closures. And with fire, when it came to managing the fires this past summer, it was all hands on deck, and it was bringing from across the agencies. It wasn't that we all needed to be staffed up at that level in the Reno Tahoe area, but we needed to know where the flexibility was and where the resources could be deployed. So I think that's part of it. You're not going to be able to think about and prepare for all of the things, but you need to know who your partners are and where your resources are. And then whenever I think about this, I think about the movie. I don't know if anybody's seen World War Z, the movie, which is different than the book, completely different. And so spoiler alert, if you're thinking about watching it, don't listen right now. But the concept of one government having that, naysayer who was poking and saying, but what if something else happens? How are we going to be prepared, right? before the pandemic, we probably, none of us or few of us were thinking about what happens if all of a sudden we can't go to the office. Well, we don't know how we're going to prepare for the next pandemic, but that's another thing we can put in our toolbox. So how are we prepared for if that thing happens? And so not being afraid to explore those unknown possibilities. And you may not know what triggers it, but how are you going to respond if something like that happens?
And Peter, if I could add one more thought, piggybacking on what Christine just said, many of our procurements, our acquisition pathways get very prescriptive, which is good because we're obligated to protect the safety, health, and welfare of people. Sometimes we get so constrained that we destroy the ability to hedge. We destroy the ability, or we restrain the ability to think about uncertain futures and give us wiggle room for planning and being flexible and being innovative for things that might have to be different in 10 years. It's not a good answer, but I'm just a suggestion that sometimes we have to look at our acquisition methodologies so that we accommodate some of this longer term uncertainty while never neglecting public safety, health, and welfare. That's going to be a challenge, but I think it's part of the mix.
I completely agree, Jerry. Florida is actually a pretty broad state in terms of being able to procure. We're one of the first to accept design build. P3s have been part of our organization for a long time, but we still have a lot of resistance. There's still a lot of, concern about litigation. Is probably the biggest thing that we're concerned about relating to how that works. But I totally agree. Mario, I'm going to jump to you next, and I'm going to change the question that I've already sent you and you prepared for, because that's what I do to you. So we know that named storm events and other weather changes can impact water and wastewater infrastructure in a major way. When combined with climate change, these things can become very serious. So any thoughts as to how local and private entities can work together to improve and prepare? I'm going to throw in one of the questions that was asked. How do cascading events, like the fact that a water or wastewater event may impact also the power infrastructure, may also impact other portions of infrastructure. How do we roll all this together? And how do we make ourselves more resilient together?
Yeah, appreciate that question. I think I've expressed this before, but you've never really, felt panic in your life until you've been without power in a storm and you see sewage backing up in your shower. That's you go from a first world country to a third world country real quick. And that's because there's no power. There's no way, the phones don't work. I mean, everybody has cell phones now, right? So nothing's working. Who do you call? How do you get people to come help? And what do you do? So, the only way to be that is to be resilient and to have these, this structure, where you've got mutual aid agreements, for example. You've got folks that, there's interconnects for water systems. There's, backup generators. There's standard operating procedures you want to follow. There's emergency response plans of action. And so those are all great. We need to continue those, improve them, revisit them. As we've talked about in this, nothing needs to stay static. We need to adapt. I think one of the questions came across of like, do we teach this in school? Do we teach green infrastructure in school? They are starting to. In cool places like MIT, I'm sure they are, right, Jerry? But some of these, they're starting to do that all over the place. They're starting to, these new a friend of mine, she's actually at Arizona with her PhD right now, and she reached out to me as one of the papers she was writing about what needs to change in the educational system. What do we need to teach? And so, that's some of the things we need to do. We need to have an eye towards the future and make it real world solutions, not just, the area under a curve because it's calculus. We need to know how do we react to these new technologies and be bold in our methods and our how we do that and how we approach, whether it be funding in P3, which is huge. So, what do we do? One of the really basics, things that I've actually heard when I started working in the utility business, the first time I saw a pop-up sewer clean out, I was like, what's that? And if you don't know what that is, it's like $15. You can Google it, like any construction supply store. Essentially, if the sewer backs up, it's like a direct line to your house. If you live on the first floor of a building, whether it's a single family home, townhome, apartment complex, whatever it is, if you're on the first floor, you get it first. So a pop-up sewer clean out actually is like a relief thing. It's the lesser of the evils, right? So it pops up, and instead of coming in your house, it's out in the lawn, but at least it goes into the lawn, not your, you're not mopping it out of the bathroom. So, that's very basics, very simple for how do we, what do we do in the near term? But ultimately, we need to do some of the things we touched on before, whether we water tighten our systems, manhole lid covers and things like that. But we need to work together, regionally on larger scales to make this work. As I mentioned, mutual aid agreements and what have you, but this climate change compact is a good example. You've got Palm Beach, Broward and Monroe counties saying, hey, we got to do it together. We won't make it. We just won't make it.
What about Miami, man?
And in Miami, I'm sorry, yes. I didn't mean to miss one, but absolutely. I mean, and so Broward County actually recently took a huge step in this direction with their, countywide risk assessment and resiliency plan outreach. It's a large scale planning and modeling effort, that's going to greatly help provide their roadmap to how future conditions will impact, all the new and improved infrastructure that they plan on doing. So things of that nature, we would do well to have, all of South Florida, to be frank, covered, all of Florida. I mean, we're coastal outside of us, I think Alaska, we're the second largest coastline in the United States. So, that's something we need to make sure that we're looking at as a holistic approach for the region. And so we need to, like I said, public and private investments, a way to do that. But make sure we have the social equity and the technology advancements as they come along. We want to make sure that we leverage all of those.
Mario, I couldn't help but enjoy one of the references you just made, which was also about educating our people.
Yep.
Yes, we have the obligation for the redundant paths, graceful degradation, aid agreements, all of those things. But our citizenry has to be taught how to be more resilient too and think that way.
Absolutely.
I often look back and it's just a personal thought. We're coming off of 150 years of a massive worldwide pathway in specialization, which has produced wonderful advancements in healthcare and all these other things. But we have this unintended consequence that all of a sudden everybody's a specialist in their own natural thing. And even ordinary citizens, there's somebody else's problem to fix for every little thing, instead of everybody having a little more resiliency personally. And I think that's part of the education of our citizens, along with all the stuff that we need to embrace in being the providers of resilient built environments.
There's no question about it. Even things like, I have a 16-year-old daughter. So, and so she, she won't use cosmetics that aren't made by, yours is 4, Peter. She won't use cosmetics if it's a company that doesn't have a resiliency plan for climate change. It's about cosmetics, but she won't use it unless they have a plan. She won't let me use, sunscreen if it messes up coral. These younger generation, whatever that's in sunscreen that messes up the coral, we have to use the $50 bottle stuff that doesn't. So, there's this younger generation is completely on board. No doubt about it.
I like to think, I was just going to jump in and I'm going to do another zombie reference. I'm sorry, but I like to think about, and I don't know why I watch these zombie things. I think I watch them because it's about the community. And so I'm thinking about Jerry's point, personal resiliency. Like there's a lot to be said for becoming more resilient as people. And when you do watch these zombie, and again, it's kind of post-apocalyptic, but you're also thinking about like climate change. How might that change the way we interact? It's good to make sure that you're prepared and that what you're going to need to do, but you also, we can't do it alone. And I think that was one of the things we saw back in, was it February with the grid in Texas and the freeze? Like the more interconnected we are, the more redundancy we have. When we lose a segment of I-15 in Nevada, there's very little redundancy to that. The alternate routes are hundreds of miles longer. Now, I can't pioneer a new parallel route, but thinking about what do we need to do to make sure that we're working together, we have interconnects, but we're also doing our own due diligence as individuals. I love the fact that Jerry brought that back, and I get that when I watch the zombie shows. It's making sure that you have enough tuna in your cabinet, but also knowing if you don't, who else in the neighborhood is going to help you? And
hey, engineers are valuable. If there's no power, you got to figure out how to filter water, right?
Yeah.
It's incredibly important to have a 4x4 pickup truck and a chainsaw to point that out. So Liz, actually, before we started talking about zombies, we were talking about green infrastructure and technology, and I know I was going to throw a question your way about this. So your question's going to change a little bit too. But how do you view changes in technology or materials modifying the landscape or options for the future? And what are the emerging trends that we may not yet be attuned to? I know that there were some questions in the Q&A about who and how to teach green infrastructure. I also heard something about the Sloan School at MIT teaching En-ROADS as an online tool and how to do that. And how do we start these sort of things as a conversation in universities? So it's a really loaded question I'm giving you. So please feel free to do with what you will with it.
Okay. Since we're all sort of misbehaving on this panel, I have to also add that I recently realized that Game of Thrones is about climate change. So I'll just drop that on you all. You all can look back. It's really about climate change, okay? And I am also a self-proclaimed zombie queen. So I feel like I found my sister over there in Christina. But so regarding this sort of broad question, technology. So one comment that I think we need to make that maybe this entire panel would agree with is, I think Mario mentioned the area under the curve and how important we thought that was back in the day in calculus and getting that right. But at the end of the day, a huge part of this and technology really comes down to us. And I'm not sure we've realized that until recently, meaning our educational systems and the engineers and the experts that we're creating. And that's so important to mention, I think, especially today, since we have younger people on here. The things like communication that we don't talk about very much in engineering education are extremely important in the realm of climate change. We've got to have engineers and infrastructure experts that know how to communicate to the public, different types of public, that understand how important it is to bring social vulnerability into your stormwater master plan, that it's no longer acceptable to just look at hydrology when you're doing a stormwater master plan, that you've got to look at social vulnerability and know how to work with that data and know how to work with the experts that created that data, because that's a new type of engineer that, there aren't a lot of them out there. It's just so important. So I think, first of all, we're the technology and we've got to become this sort of new realm of expert. There's also, we haven't mentioned it on this panel, but I think a lot of us have probably heard this before, but traditionally, we engineers have not done a very good of promoting our profession, that we're horrible at PR for ourselves. And, we just received all of this infrastructure funding, except for Peter. We just received all of this infrastructure funding, and we're short engineers. And civil engineering, environmental engineering, ecological engineering, ag and bio, all of that is very exciting. And I want to I'll end with a comment going back to something Mario said, and just my own education and my own path. I got into environmental engineering because of green infrastructure projects, and they've been around. We've been talking about a lot of these things for a long time. We've been talking about the phrase environmental justice since the 1960s. We've been talking about green infrastructure. I think the first conference I ever attended when I graduated, we talked about green infrastructure and LID for stormwater the entire conference. And we're still not implementing it widely. We're still treating treatment plants as an engineered system. And then when we go to design a stormwater project that's highly landscaped, we're focusing mostly on the aesthetic aspects of the project. These are engineered systems. And if we had engineers that knew how to better explain that project, and that it's engineered, and that we need to get the water right and the treatment correct, we would be able to achieve that. So I think, technology is moving at a rapid pace, but it's the human part of it that most concerns me.
If I could pick up on one point that Liz made about technology, I often, in my future world vision project, I look far out, and it has a big technology component. Technology so often is not something that is generated from within our profession. And so I get this feeling that we either become the beneficiaries or the victims of it. But we should embrace the fact that we have the stewardship role. We're the stewards of taking technology that comes from lots of different industries, and when it plugs into or gets applied to or becomes part of our processes for infrastructure in a built environment, we're the ones who know best how to adopt or adapt those technologies. We shouldn't let it just happen to us. But we have the next generation that's on a wave. If it's new and it's technical, oh man, that's what we need. We have to be stewards of how this applies.
I completely agree, Jerry. I mean, I serve on several department advisory boards for local universities throughout the state of Florida, and we try to figure out how much technology to adopt. We're always slow to adopt technology, but at the same time, stormwater models now require that you rent time from the servers at Amazon World Services just in order to get the computing power that you need to do, so you don't have to sit there for 4 weeks. You do use artificial intelligence to run scenarios for you, and this is just coming from a relatively small company like mine. We're definitely embracing technology, and I don't think people look at technology the same way. So I've already been instructed we only have 4 minutes left. And so what I really wanted to do is have everyone go around and spend a minute just talking about how all of these local resiliency, national resiliency, any kind of strategies that we have also impact ensuring that equity is part of planning in the environment. So I know Director Swallow, I said I was going to start with you so everybody else can think about what they're going to say while you start, Christina.
I think what we really need to be thinking about, and Liz kind of led to this in her last remarks, is that we need to be thinking about equity in all things. It should not be an added on. It has to be core. It has to be baked in. We need to be understanding how our systems are impacting everyone. And I really think that, there has been a historic tendency to be equal, but that's not what we're talking about here. We need to be thinking about the impact of our systems on all of the people in our communities and making sure that we're providing that quality of life, safety and quality of life that we talk about all the time. It's a core premise of our industry, a core premise of our profession. We need to be talking about, we need to be thinking about everyone. This isn't an extra, this is a core piece of our industry and our profession.
Thank you. Who wants to jump in next?
I'll give a thought. Outcomes. I'm a big fan. You look at the outcomes. You look at the outcomes of what we're doing for every economic strata, every social strata, every ethnic strata, whatever it is. And you judge what you're going to do. You don't jump on programs just to join the bandwagon. You look at the outcomes. Is it going to produce what we desire for everyone?
Liz, you jumped in on a lot of this. Do you have any follow-ups?
I like all of the comments I'm hearing. I would love to see a world where our engineering and infrastructure teams are diverse and representative of the communities that we're serving.
Yeah, I would say, being inclusive and diverse in our thought and in the folks that are doing the work. I mean, some things that, we wouldn't think of is, hey, if there's a hurricane coming, get on a plane and go up to see relatives in Colorado. Well, not everybody can afford the plane ticket. There's nowhere for some people to go. That's what we're talking about. So ultimately, it's our responsibility just to make sure we leave a legacy that, that we can be proud of for future generations, that everybody's inputs are thought of, and that we've got, we leave it better than we found it at the end of the day.
And Peter, my big takeaway is I need to watch more zombie movies.
I know. I had no idea.
28 days later, that's a good one.
So I'd like to thank the entire panel. It's been an absolute pleasure. If you can't tell, I love every one of the people on this panel. Really and truly, we tried to integrate the questions that were coming in real time into the questions that we were asking. So I apologize if we didn't get to your question, but please feel free to follow with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Leach.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. That was a really illuminating panel. Thank you to all of the panelists as well. Next up, we'll be remembering some of the climate champions that Southeast Florida has lost in the last year. To join the next session, please go back to the CVent portal and click on the link for the next session. Thank you all and goodbye.